JWTs have become the standard for web authentication. And today we're going to learn how they work and how to implement it in our Zig REST API. JWTs are actually just an open standard which define a way to securely transmit data. What we're going to use it for is authentication is what it's commonly used for. We're going to be able to mint a JWT when the user logs in, and then that user will use that JWT for every subsequent API request. But what does the JWT look like? Well, we can really break it down into three parts. The first being the header. So that's going to be the type, JWT, and the algorithm. In this case, we're using HS256, and then the payload. So if we look down here, we see the payload, which there's going to be some things that's always going to be there, like the issued at or expiry, which I guess you may not always have expiry. And then we'll also have the claims data. So this is this is the JSON that you're putting in the JWT. In this case, it can be username, password, it can just be the password. It's just going to be all that data you put to store in that JWT, and there's going to be a signing secret. This is very important for us because you need a secret to be able to keep things secure, and this is the one thing that when we get into the code, we're going to see we use environment variables, and it's going to keep it all secure. Well, what does our API look like today? We have the client, which is just the curl command. What it does is it makes an API call to the server to get notes, and then the server responds back with the 200 and the response body. So it sends back all the notes data. But what do we want? This is the new flow we're going to want, and it's a little bit more complex. So first we're going to have the client, we're going to get them to log in. So it's going to hit the login endpoint, and it's going to hit the server. The server is going to validate the credentials. So this user will have to already be in the database. And when we log in, we're going to send the username and password. Then our server is going to validate that that's correct. And then after it's validated that, we're going to create the JWT and send it back to the client. The client will store this in whatever way. It can be in like the browser session, or it can be, you can just literally copy paste it across, which is what we'll do in Postman. And then now we're going to make an API call. The client's going to make an API call passing in that JWT as a bearer token. And then the server will validate that JWT. Is the person who they say they are? And then if they are, we'll send back the API response and again, send back the notes. So then what do we need to do? Well, the first thing we need to do is have a users table. In this case, it's just going to be username and password. And I'm already going to set this up ahead of time for us to make it easy, but we are going to get into password hashing and implement that ourselves. And same with this new post users endpoint. That's going to be there when we jump into the code, but then we're going to add on hashing and password. And then we'll need the new get/login endpoint, which is where they'll pass in the username and password and then respond back with the JWT. And then we're just going to add on header validation or JWT validation onto all of our notes endpoints and make sure that if they aren't authenticated, we send back a 401. Now let's just jump into it. And we're back in the code now. So as you can see, there are some differences. I've gone in and added just a couple of things. So let's look into it. So we see we have this user struct. So that's exactly what we are. You know, when we are authenticating, we need a user, a username and password, right? Very simple stuff. And what that means is one, we need a table. So we're just storing username and password. We also need a way to create a user. So this is basically the CRUD stuff that we did in the last episode. And then we also need to be able to get a user. So in this case, we're selecting a password from user where the username is what we enter because we'd already have the username. Otherwise, we see there's a jwt.zig file in there. We'll get back to that right away. But then let's jump in to our main. Okay, so like I said, we have the user. And then jumping down, we also have the create users table. So at the start, when we create our server, we just want to make sure our database is up to date and has this table. The one thing I did add, let's clean this up a little bit, is we have, if you hit /user, then we create a user, otherwise respond method not allowed, just like we've done before. So if it's a post request on /user, we create a user, and we'll get into that right away. But everything else has stayed the same. And then we'll also have just a couple helper functions. So login, which we will implement. I want to make sure we fully implement that ourselves. Bearer token, which we'll come back to that. Respond unauthorized, which that's another thing we'll come back to. Then the other helper is just invalid user. So invalid username or password, which we'll come back to. So then let's just look at create user. We're just going to quickly look through this. So first, just before we have our read body. So we'll get the body because it's a post request. And then we'll parse it. So this is actually a nice thing we can do is parse from slice a user from the body. So what we're doing is we're essentially returning a user like the user document that we saw at the top, which just has username and password. And then JSON can parse it right into that struct for us. And we grab the credentials, and as long as they exist, both the lengths aren't 0, we'll continue. But if they are, then we'll say then the body didn't contain one of them. So we'll say they're required. And then we have create user, which we already saw. And if that fails, we'll return, in this case, we'll assume if there's an error at this point, it's because the user is already in the database. And then we need a response. So we're just going to respond back with the username in JSON. So we'll get the username from the row and formulate a response like we've done everywhere else, and then respond created with that JSON. You see how when we create a user, we're just directly putting the password. That's the very first thing I want to look at. We should never store passwords in plain text. That's what this does right now. It's just going to, whatever the user types or you put in, that's what's going to get stored in the database. So the very first thing we're going to do is actually learn how to hash a password in Zig. And Zig actually makes this extremely easy because it has a password hashing library in the standard library. So we're not using any external dependencies in this video, just like in the very first video, but let's write it. And now let's get into here. So we're going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it auth.zig. And in here, we'll need our standard library. And then from there, we can get the password hash. So pw hash equals std crypto.pw hash. And then we'll give it a size. So pub const password hash buffer size equals 256. And then we're just going to write one function for now. We're going to write another one later. But first, let's just do a hash password. All right, so what's this going to take? So we're going to need an allocator. Allocator, we'll need IO, c.io, password, just const 28, so the string password. And then we'll need an out. This will be an out kind of call. So password hash, the main size that we defined, or the max size, I mean, and then it will return a string. Okay, and this is really easy to do. So we're just going to return pw hash dot argon2 dot string hash, do the password, perfect, and then allocator equals allocator, and params, this is what we're going to do is OWASP to ID, and then out and IO. Okay, so what did we just do? Well, let's look in here. So one, we're using Argon 2, which that's kind of the crypto side of things, like the actual hashing algorithm that we're using. But what parameters are we using or passing to it? Well, we just put OWASP. What is this? Well, if we're using the Argon 2 ID hashing, this is the recommendation for like web security standards. So if you've never heard of OWASP, it's kind of just like, it is like web security standards, like I said. And it's directly, this is in Zig itself. So it's the recommended one. So we're going to use it. Okay. And hopping back over. So we're going to need what we just wrote. So const auth equals import auth.zig. Perfect. And now let's head back over to create user. And now when we come over here, so we validated our credentials, but now what we want to do is actually hash the password and store the hash password. Okay, so we'll get that buffer that we need, hash buffer, auth.password, hash buffer size, max size, u8 equals undefined, and then password hash is try auth dot hash password. So we'll pass in the app.allocator, app.io, it goes credentials.password, and then password hash buffer. And that's all we have to do. So now instead of directly putting in the password, we will just put in the password hash. And now it's all it took to hash a password securely to industry standards and save it in our DB. Okay, now that we've gotten all that out of the way and we're fully up to date and have users as an entity in our app, let's get into JWTs. So as you saw earlier, as I pointed out, there's a JWT file in here. And if we look, it's only 150 lines, and it's an entire JWT implementation that can issue a token and verify a token. So that's all we need for being able to do basic authentication. You could use a JWT library. I do some research. There's a couple Zig ones out there. But I just wanted to show how it's possible to just write our own Zig code. And all the code is always down in the description. So if you want to go check it out, definitely do. But yeah, so let's just quickly look at this. Again, this isn't really to teach the internals of JWT. So I want to more show how to use it, but just quickly going over it. We'll have a header and some claims. We're going to issue a token. So every token, this is important, needs a secret. And then in our case, we're pairing it to a username, or it can just be text that you're putting in your claims. But secret is important because that's the first thing we're going to wire up right away. But then we go in and create a token based off the different claims. How do we use it? So let's head back over to main.zig, and just like we did over here, we will need JWT. And like I said, we need to be able to wire up the secret. So where does the secret come from? Well, we're just going to store it in the environment variables. It can't just be taken. Like, you don't want to ever commit this with your GitHub repo because someone will see it. Okay. And in Zig, how do we fetch it? Well, it's actually pretty easy with Zig 0.16, which is pretty awesome. So we'll just say JWT secret equals init environ map, which is our environment variables, .get, and we will call it JWT secret, or else we'll just log JWT secret variable. M variable is required. And this should actually be print. There we go. And now if JWT secret dot length equals 0, we also want to return an error. Missing JWT secret. Also want the same thing. WT variable is required. And let's just say variable must be not empty. Sweet. And now if we head over to our app, we're actually going to store this, and we're also going to need sc.io. So let's just store it now. And then we'll also want JWT secret. And as we saw in our flow diagram from the start, the first thing we need to do is be able to mint a JWT or create a JWT, and that's going to be the login route. So let's go ahead and implement a login route. Okay, and now that we're in our router, let's just copy and paste the user one and head over to /login instead. And same, this will be login. There we go. And now let's go ahead and implement our login method. Okay, and let's actually head back over and just take some code that we were in. So we know we need to get the body and also a user, because just like creating a user, we're gonna send username and password. When you log in, you also have to send username and password. So we're just gonna take that exact same code, read the body, and then get a user. We also can just do the same validation on credentials. So a lot of similarities here with the create user. So now we need to be able to get the user, because that's the first thing we're gonna do. Because remember, when we are logging in, we need to be able to fetch the user from the database with the provided username and password, or they just will fetch the user from the username. And then what we're going to do is we're going to hash the password that they passed in the request body and compare that to the value we stored in the database. And so row equals try app pool row embed file, as always, SQL/get user. And then we'll do credentials.username. And then or else return respond invalid user with the request. And again, invalid user is one of the ones I just added at the start to help make this code a little bit easier. And then defer row dinit and catch any error there. Perfect. And now we're going to grab the password hash, row.get u8, and it'll be in position 0. And now if not try. Right. So actually one thing we need to do is head back to auth. Like I said before, we hashed the password, but we need to be able to verify 2 passwords. So let's write that function. Okay, pub function verify password. So I'll take an allocator and IO. Then we need a password hash and a password to compare against. Okay, now let's write the body. So again, this is going to be very easy. Password hash, argon2, string verify. We're going to pass the password hash, then the password. Options will be allocator, and then also needs IO. And then we'll catch the error and return false. So if it errored, we say it's invalid. We actually can just do an underscore. So if it failed to verify, then we return false. Otherwise, return true. So now let's head back over to where we were. Perfect. So now if not, auth.verify password, app.allocator, app.io, password hash, and credential.password. Then we'll respond invalid user request. Otherwise, okay, so now we know that the password's valid, so we've done that part. Perfect. Now let's create a new JWT. So first we'll get now io clock real.now app.io dot 2 seconds, and now let's create a token. Try JWT issue token app.allocator app.jwt secret credentials.username and the exact time, and we need to be able to free the token at the end. And this is essentially all we've done. Now we just need to respond back with the JWT. So when a user hits login, we'll just respond back with the token that they'll then use to make the subsequent request with. And this is again something we've done quite a few times now. So std array list u8 is empty, defer response dot dinit app.allocator and response.print app.allocator, use the F formatting and do JSON dot format token equals token type equals bearer, which we'll see where bearer comes into play pretty soon. Expires in JWT token lifetime seconds. So that's how long it'll last. There we go. And then we'll just respond. Request, okay. Response dot items. So now we've almost done everything. The last thing to do is now when we hit login, we get JWT back. Now we need to basically put the authentication behind our notes routes, right? So we need to be able to check that the JWT is present, and that's for the same user that's logged in. And now let's see what that looks like. So remember how we had this respond unauthorized? Well, it's actually just really one line, just paste it in here. So we're going to say authentication required. This HTTP status is 401 unauthorized, and then extra headers will be, say it's JSON as before. Then we'll also add this authenticate to say we take bearer tokens for authentication. Being able to create a user, you don't need to be authenticated. Obviously, you can authenticate if you're not a user, and log in. Obviously, you can authenticate because you need to log in. But now we're going to say any route below this, you need to log in, right? So what we're going to do is say const token equals bearer token request, or else return unauthorized, respond unauthorized, right? Okay, and again, we didn't really look at the bearer token. So this is the last thing that I had filled in at the start. Add all the headers on request and find a bearer token, and as it returns an optional. So if it can't find a token, we're going to say a 401. If you didn't even attempt to provide a token, you're not going to be able to hit these routes. And now let's get now again. Clock real now app.io 2 seconds. And now we can do the JWT verify. I also realized I just said now like 10 times. Sorry for that. App JWT secret token now, and we'll catch any error and return respond unauthorized with the request. And really, that's it. So let's test it out. One thing we need to consider is make sure our actual Postgres database is up. So if you don't have it up running, check out the last video where we set up Postgres and all this. And this is, if you don't know by this point, that this is a series. First, we made a basic card API, then we added Postgres, and now we're adding authentication. And let's test it out. So the very first thing we're going to need to do is remember how I said environment variables. This is probably the easiest way for, in our case, you can either set this before and then just run Zig build run every subsequent time. But if you want to be able to change it or just have it scoped to just this one command. Doing this will set this environment variable just for this process. So let's run that. And I guess we shall see, yeah, probably have some compilation errors. Okay, so let's look. So our app is down here. So .io equals io and .jwt secret equals JWT secret. Obviously forgot that. Let's try that again. There you go. Okay, so now we're gonna open up Postman. And the very first thing we're gonna do is just try and hit our slash notes. And as you can see, we got 401, authentication required. That's because, well, one, we're not providing any token. If you look at our headers, we can see the ones here, there's nothing going through. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is, well, create a user. We have a post request to that slash user, which is the one I set up at the start. But again, the password is going to be hashed in the database. So first, let's send a post request. So now we have the user. Perfect. And now let's try and hit our slash login endpoint. So we're going to, with the exact same credentials that we just created our user, we're going to hit login. And there we go. So you see we got a token, it's a bearer token, and expires in that many seconds. Now let's go in and copy this. And we head over to our list notes. What we're going to do is switch it to bearer token. So this is exactly why we look at bearer tokens, because this is the kind of authentication we're going to do. Now we can just paste in that token. If we hit it again, so we see we were no longer hit with a 401. Okay, and now let's try and create a note. So just say hi YouTube. We go in, and something I had done right before is I pasted that same bearer token in here. It's the exact same thing. And now I created a couple notes. So if we try and hit our notes again, we see we have our 2 notes here. And I hope you enjoyed the video. I thought this is a lot of fun. You know, this is my first time actually going into Zig and using JWTs and doing authentication. And it was surprisingly easy. Having password hashing directly in the standard library, I think, is a huge feature of Zig. Like, don't have to use any sort of external thing. Argon 2 is there, bcrypt, scrypt's also there. You can just hash our passwords. Very easy. And as you saw, a basic JWT implementation, I think, was 152 lines of Zig code. That's not that bad. You know, like, we can get this working with just the standard library, and I think that's such a powerful feature of Zig. But what's next for this series? Truly making this a scalable API. So right now it's going to process one request after another pretty linearly, but really what we want is to have like tiny routines or coroutines, if you use Go routines, that whenever a request comes in, it just kicks it off and can handle that, which there's this new std.io evented interface, which was slightly introduced in kind of more of a beta in Zig 0.16, but doesn't work with networking. So I plan on, once that's finished, which I haven't looked in a while, it might be in 0.17, that's when I plan to make that video of truly building a scalable API. But please drop a comment below and tell me what other things you want to see with this API. And if you enjoyed, come join the Discord, links down in the description, and have a great day.